gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Dr. Roger Highfield, Professor Martin Rees, and Dr. Brian May.
Good evening, welcome to the Science Museum. I'm Roger Highfield, the Science Director here, and welcome to the opening event of our monster Summer of Space season, which will see all sorts of space-related events until the end of August. It's an incredible pleasure to welcome two rock stars of astronomy to the Science Museum tonight to help celebrate humankind's greatest adventure, the Apollo moon landings. They don't really need any introduction whatsoever, but I will introduce them anyway. First of all, we have Astronomer Royal Lord Martin Rees. Martin's the author of On the Future, Prospects for Humanity, and it explores space travel along with themes like robotics, AI, and climate change. And second, we've got astrophysicist and legendary Queen songwriter and guitarist Dr. Brian May. Brian's written Mission Moon 3D with David Eicher. It's published by the London Stereoscopic Company, and it's live streaming this event to its Facebook page. Thank you, Brian. There will be signed copies after the event. We're going to range through the past, present, and future of space travel, but actually first, Brian, just tell me a little bit about that rousing New Horizons video that came before us.
Yeah, it's quite a long story really, but I'll make it short. It was kind of commissioned because I've been working with the New Horizons team under Alan Stern while they did the flyby of Pluto a couple of years ago, and Alan just rang me up and said, I've got something very important to say to you. And I thought, what the hell is he going to... And he said, I want you to write a piece of music for us for the flyby of Ultima Thule, which is the Kuiper Belt object which they visited after Pluto. Now, they didn't even know they were going to do that until they were past Pluto, because it hadn't been discovered. And I said, how can I write a song about Ultima Thule? What rhymes with Ultima Thule? And then I thought, the mission is called New Horizons, and what does that mean? And suddenly the whole thing kind of unfolded in my mind. And I wrote it with Don Black, who's a very well-known and wonderful lyricist, an old friend of mine. And the thing became a celebration of man's endeavor to explore, which, of course, this is a great example, one of the finest examples ever. And this is the furthest man has ever been, 4 billion miles away. Of course, he's not there. There's no man in it. But the probe that he's made has gone that far.
Now, what about Mission Moon 3D? We've got some images coming up, I think, from the book. Just tell us a little bit about your love of stereoscopic imagery and how it came about and so on.
Yeah, it's another very long story, really, but
keep it quite keep it short.
Yeah, well, it all starts with Weetabix when I was a kid, because they used to give you... Seriously, they used to give you little cards, which were 3D cards. I didn't know what it was in those days. I was about 9 years old. And they said, send away a packet of them, 1 and 6pence, and you can get a viewer to see these things in 3D, which I did. And suddenly this hippopotamus, instead of being 2 little flat pictures, was like a real animal, and I felt like I could go through this frame and actually touch it. So I was knocked out, and I have been ever since. I kept thinking when I was still young, if you can make 3D pictures that are that real and that evocative, why would you bother with the flat pictures, which we all do? So this book what we did was, for this book, we went back into the NASA archives and found lots of pictures which make 3D if they're combined. It takes a little bit of work sometimes to iron out the problems, but basically you need 2 points of view, the same as the 2 points of view that your eyes give you every day of your life. And these 2 points of view for astronomical bodies have to be quite far apart. But you can find that. And everything in space rotates, so you can choose your moments and get a baseline that way. The astronauts were actually trained to take 3D pictures, but mostly they forgot, because there's a lot on their minds, Nevertheless, Michael Collins, while his 2 mates are down on the walking on the moon, he's taking 3D pictures as his module goes around. So we have those, and most of this stuff hasn't been seen properly stereoscopic before. So you get your book, and the pictures that we worked months and months on, some of it while I was on tour with Queen, etc. And you get your viewer in the back, so you can see them in 3D.
And I think we've got an example of two images that show one of the problems. I don't know if we can move on to the ghostly image. I'm staring at my... Right, here we are. Brian, just talk us through this. This shows one of the problems you had to deal with in producing the book.
This is funny, because everybody had rejected this as a stereo pair, because you can see there's a bit of a problem. There's a man in this one, and there isn't in that one, right? What's happened is Cernan has been taking his panoramic pictures. He's actually not taking 3D. When you're taking panoramic pictures like this, click, 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 you're actually moving and getting your baseline. So we chose these two pictures, put them together, and of course you get a ghost of Jack Schmidt who's walking through the scene. But with a little bit of work in Photoshop, you can restore it, and we managed to put him back in the other image. So in the book, you'll see him fully fleshed, Jack Schmidt on the moon. So it's a lot of fun to make these images, and they are so real. Charlie Duke actually said it's the closest thing to being on the moon you can get without.
There we are.
So that's the best accolade.
Of an
we have.
Apollo astronaut himself, so fantastic.
Absolutely. So I've said enough now. I think I'll go.
So Martin,
Yes.
now on the future. Now that came out last summer, and it was sort of a follow-up to your 2003 book, Our Final Hour, and you were looking at all these awful existential threats to humanity in the coming century. How are things looking now compared with 2003? I can't believe they're any rosier than they were then.
Well, we know something's better, but let me just say that any predictions I make should not be taken too seriously. I have the title of Astronomer Royal, and sometimes people think I'm an astrologer. Indeed, I've been asked sometimes, do you do the Queen's horoscopes? I respond to that by saying with a straight face, well, if she wants one, I'm the man she'd ask. But she hasn't yet. And I have taken in one or two people, you know, and made their predictions, and they listen with great attention to my predictions about the stock market will fluctuate, etc., etc. But then I come clean, and I say I'm actually just a scientist, and my predictions, therefore, aren't very good. Almost as bad as those of economists, but not quite as bad as economists. But anyway, that's a preface. But in my book, it's rather pretentiously called On the Future, and it is trying to look ahead. There are two things which I discussed at the beginning of the book which we can predict. One is that by the middle of the century, we'll have a more crowded world. The world population is now 7.7 billion. It'll be about 9 billion by then. And we'll have a warmer world, due to the CO2 production by fossil fuel generation. So we can predict those things, and I address what we can do to cope with them. But then I also discuss future technologies, bio, cyber, AI, robotics, etc., and of course space, which is what we're here to talk about. And I think if we look at space, then we're going to be celebrating the wonderful moon landings just over 50 years ago, just under 50 years ago, and we are also going to be talking about space more generally. And I think, although we'll talk about this more, that it's amazing when we look back at what they achieved with the much more primitive technology. To go back to Brown's film, let's remember that those pictures of Ultima Thule were transmitted back by a very small transmitter, and the technology that was being used was at least 15 years out of date, because the probe was about 15 years on its journey, and of course you have to freeze the design several years before launch. And so if you think how iPhones have changed in the last 15 years, realize how much better we could do today, and how exciting is the possibility of exploring the solar system with the most modern technology. So I think we can be excited about that, and in my book I discuss near-term projects of that kind, and also longer-term prospects for humanity in space.
It's extraordinary what we can do with so little. I think, Brian, you were saying that the amplifier on New Horizons was what, 30 watts?
It's a 30-watt amp, like my guitar amp. Yeah, we can pick up. And like as Martin says, you know, you're looking at basically the dial-up technology which we all used not that long ago. You know, the information for these wonderful pictures is coming back incredibly slowly, as if it were, you know, on a phone link like we used to use.
So let's wind back to July '69. Where were you both on the night of the moon landings, and what did it mean to each of you? Brian, let's start with you.
First, I was in Cornwall with my drummer, Roger Taylor, in his mum's house, in front of a TV about that size, and I will never forget it, watching, you know, these very grainy and hard to distinguish pictures, but there you could see the man go down onto the moon, and he said, you know, this is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
So did you, you know, drink yourselves to oblivion and joy?
Oh, always. Doesn't need a moon landing to do that. No. We drank tea and celebrated. But it was something I will never forget, I must say. And it seemed miraculous. I do remember my dad, who was in space aeronautics, a couple of years earlier saying, we won't get to the moon in my lifetime. I know we won't, but we did. It was an incredible achievement. And you've seen some of the recent moon landings fail, you know, and you think even now with the enormous technologically, how far we are advanced now, but it can still fail. If it had failed for those guys, we would have lost those wonderful pilots. They didn't make a mistake.
Martin, what about you? Where were you on that night?
Well, I was at Cambridge. I was a young researcher working in the institute run by Fred Hoyle, and I do remember in the evening of the night watching the One Small Step in my college on the television they had there. But then I remember going into work the next morning and seeing how excited Fred Hoyle was. He was more excited than me because he'd been thinking about this for much longer than I had, before going back to when he was young. And I realised only fully when I talked to Fred Hoyle just what a big deal this was. I didn't sink in really until I realised that a great man like Fred Hoyle really was so excited. And of course, in retrospect, it is really far more exciting. And of course, the other thing is, we just realised how risky it is. In fact, one thing I quote in my book is the speech which had been written by President Nixon's speechwriter to be given if they got stuck on the moon and never came back. It was an eloquent speech, and thank goodness they never had to use it. But of course, if we look back at that time, it was touch and go. Something could have gone wrong, and it could have been a disaster, something we remember quite differently. But it is amazing that none of the Apollo astronauts who actually went to the moon failed to come back.
I mean, Hoyle's a kind of fascinating figure. I mean, he was steady-state theories, anti-Big Bang, into nuclear synthesis and so on, and I think wrote science fiction as well. What do you think it was just the sheer, the fact that it was this epic human endeavour that excited him, or was it the technology?
I think it was both. I mean, he was certainly very interested in the technology, but he, through science fiction, was interested. He speculated about the future, and of course, one other handle on this was that there was a colleague of his called Tommy Gold, who was famous for thinking that there was very thick dust on the moon and that the astronauts would all sink down into it like in a quicksand. And I think he was quite glad that Tommy Gold was wrong, not just for the fate of the astronauts, but he liked to prove Tommy Gold wrong.
Brian, something you said really resonates with me in the Science Museum about it seeming almost more incredible today than it did back then, because, you know, we have Apollo 10, that did the dry run to the moon. And I think when people looked at Apollo 10, that little brown command module 15, 20 years ago, they would have felt, moon bases, Mars bases, there's a kind of inevitability about it. When I see people looking at it today, they're looking at it like they don't really believe that 3 men got to the moon in it. It seems it's an unusual object in the museum, because most objects get a bit banal and boring the older they get. Was actually Apollo 10 seems to be turning into a magical object. People can't quite believe it did what it did.
Yeah, I mean, I hope they do believe. I don't have any time for the conspiracy theory nonsense that goes on. It's all very singular. Just mention that, yeah. But yeah, you look at it, and it's almost impossible to believe that those people did it. It was incredibly crammed, and they had things to deal with which are not often talked about, like their bodily functions. You know, a lot of them got sick, and if they threw up, it was a major problem because it fills your whole capsule. And if it had happened on the moon, they would have died because there's no way that can clear itself in small amount of gravity in a spacesuit if you can't take your helmet off. So yes, and again, the technological and the human part of it, I think, is almost unbelievable because it needed them to be skillful pilots, particularly Neil Armstrong. You know, that wouldn't have happened if he hadn't had the incredible presence of mind to steer to a place which hadn't been planned and land the thing properly.
They almost ran out of fuel, didn't they?
Close as anything, yes. Amazing. So it really was a great human endeavour.
In fact, we had on this stage, and I think you were there as well, Brian, Leonov, Alexei Leonov, who was in the mid-60s practicing to be the first Soviet cosmonaut on the moon.
He would have been.
And when you talk to Leonov about the margins for a Soviet landing, they make the American one look very luxurious indeed. He had seconds in a single cosmonaut lander. I think he would have come a cropper.
Yeah, of course he does have the great honour of being the first man to walk in space. Yeah. And nearly didn't make it back because his spacesuit ballooned
up.
There
are images in your book, I
yeah, and he couldn't get back in. Imagine that. You're stuck out in space and you can't get back in. So he had incredible presence of mind. They're all amazing people. And we've both had the pleasure of working with Neil Armstrong, haven't we? And what an amazing, inspirational human being.
In fact, you've both given talks, haven't you, with Neil Armstrong sort of sitting in the front row. That must be a bit intimidating.
Right.
Tell your story first.
Well, I mean, this was an American Academy where he was made a new member, and new members had the front row, and I was giving a talk, and he was sitting there, seemed to be taking notes. Maybe he was doing the crossword, I don't know, but it was a great privilege to meet him there, to talk to him afterwards, and he came to England once or twice after that. I saw him, but that was my experience, and yours was similar?
Yeah, I was at the very first Starmus Festival, which has given me so much. And I'd already written my talk, which was why are we in space and should we be in space? And I suddenly realised I was going to give this talk to Neil Armstrong sitting there and many other astronauts and cosmonauts. And I really nearly lost my bottle because I thought, you know, how dare I go up there and say that maybe man shouldn't be in space? I was actually saying that the majority of men shouldn't be in space. I wasn't going to say. Anyway, I just thought, what on earth is he going to think? After my talk, Neil Armstrong came back and said, you were right to say that. He said it's time that humanity got itself together before it goes en masse into space. And he ended up his talk with something very similar. He says, and I don't know whether it was because of that conversation or not, but he said, let's hope that we see the last century as a century of human and technological endeavor, and let's hope the next century is about the improvement in human character. So that's still how I feel. I don't think we should be going into space polluting it the same way as we've polluted our own wonderful planet.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing which we should remember is that at the time when we had the Apollo landings, I think most of us thought there'd be footprints on Mars long before today. And indeed there would have been had there been a motive, because the Apollo program was supported by 4% of the American federal budget. NASA's budget now is 0.6%, because the 4% was funded not for science, but simply for superpower rivalry to get there before the Russians. And for that reason, as we know, no one after 1972 has been beyond low Earth orbit. And this is remarkable because I'm old enough, as is Brian, to remember this as an event which is something we will never forget. But of course, for many people in the audience, and certainly all my students, it's long before they were born. It's ancient history. Students know that the Americans landed a man on the moon. They know the Egyptians built pyramids, but these both seem mysterious national goals motivated by reasons that we can't fully understand. And it is very odd, really, that for younger people, it's a historical thing. Whereas we grew up to think of it as futuristic and thinking it was the first step towards a program that would have led to humans beyond Mars and maybe elsewhere long before today.
So, Martin, do you think if Cold War rivalry had persisted, we would have Mars bases by now?
I don't think so, because I think the Americans asserted that this would show their preeminence, and it did. But I think if we look to the future and think of a revival of the Apollo spirit, which perhaps we'll talk about later, I think there could be superpower rivalry involving China, because of course China has the resources and the dirigi's government to run a program rather like the Apollo program, and of course if they wanted to assert their superpower parity with the United States, it wouldn't be enough to go back to the moon and do what the Americans had done more than 50 years earlier. They'd have to do a further great leap forward and go to Mars. So you can imagine that there could be a political standoff like there was in the Cold War, where China would feel motivated to assert its superpower supremacy by being the first to land on Mars. I don't think that's very likely, but I think that's a possibility.
Martin, you mentioned the speech that had been prepared in case it all went horribly wrong. In fact, fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. What do you both think would have happened if Apollo 11 had gone wrong?
I think they would have pulled the plug, actually. That's what I think. Some bad things happened, you know, early on in the space program. We lost astronauts and we lost cosmonauts, and they carried on. But I think that amount of visibility at that point in the program would have killed it. You know, I don't know what you think, Martin.
I mean, I'm not sure, because I think everyone realized it was extremely risky, and I suspect the astronauts and the American public would have wanted to continue and try and succeed. It was different later, because I think one of the problems with the later American space program, when they launched the shuttle, was that they became very risk averse, and the shuttle, which was less dramatic, it took people only into low Earth orbit, into the space station, and it was launched, I think, 135 times. And there were 2 spectacular failures when the crew of 7 was all killed. And each of those was a national trauma in America, and delayed the program by 3 years while they tried to make it safer still. But of course, a 2% risk is something quite acceptable to test pilots and also to adventurers. And so I think what went wrong was that, whereas I think everyone accepted the Apollo astronauts were adventurers taking big risks, they tried to present launches of the shuttle as being routine. They sent up a woman school teacher and all that. And I think that was a big mistake, to talk about it as though it was like tourism. And then that made people feel that it really had to be safe. And that increased the expense. And I personally think that a revival of manned spaceflight, going beyond low Earth orbit, will have to be the consequence of a reversal of their attitudes, so that they are prepared to accept risks, and people know these people are risking their lives like those who do dangerous sports. And of course that will revive the glamour, because people going around in orbit in the space station, they never really made the news unless something went wrong. If the loo didn't work, or if Chris Hadfield played his guitar and sang, not as well as Brian. But that's what made the news. The routine stuff in the space station didn't make the news. It didn't inspire people.
Just to pick up on a point that you made, Brian, you know, the Apollo missions were so incredibly televised that, you know, you felt like the whole world was looking over their shoulders. And actually, one of the things that really sticks in my mind is Alexei Leonov, who wanted to be the first on the moon. The Russians could never get their heavy launch vehicle to work properly, but he described how no one in the Soviet Union could see the Apollo moon landings, but he went to a technical institute outside Moscow, and he could watch them go down. And again, he was amazed that the Americans were so public in everything, that they didn't have the extraordinary news control that they had in the Soviet Union. And actually there was a sort of sweet moment when there was incredible camaraderie, when it was clear that he was cheering on, you know, Armstrong and Aldrin to get down safely.
Yeah, of course they didn't have any contact at that time, and they did not share information, which led to some very unnecessary deaths, particularly the business of oxygen being used as a breathing medium inside the capsule, which killed Russians first, and then it killed Americans after. Yes, and they didn't know each other until much later when they got together at sort of events, media events, and then they became very, very close because they'd shared these experiences in different ends of the earth, but very similar experiences. It's wonderful to watch them at Starmus. I think I have pictures of Alexei Leonov and Leonov, actually in the book, discussing stuff which perhaps they never had the opportunity until that moment. Wonderful. Those men experienced stuff which no one has ever experienced since.
Brian, I know you were very close to the late great Patrick Moore, astronomer, also big TV personality as well. We were very lucky in the museum to acquire his collection, and he plays quite a special role in the moon landings as well, doesn't he? I don't know if you can tell us more
Absolutely.
about
Well,
that.
for a start, he mapped the moon. He was one of the great cartographers of the moon, and the Apollo people did actually use some of his data to plan the missions. Also, he was the commentator on the English TV broadcast, and so he's the person who brought the moon landing to the British public. I think probably the greatest outreach astronomer of all time, Patrick. And I was very fond of him, and he became a sort of honorary uncle of mine, and brought me back to astronomy after I'd spent 30 years doing something else. I don't know. And he said, "Right, you could finish off your PhD." And I went, "I can't. My brain doesn't work."
He to encourage you to get your
Absolutely, yes. He said, "You can do it, but of course you can. You go back to." Strangely enough, I did. I went back to Imperial College and knuckled down for a year and got the PhD, all thanks to Patrick.
And you dealt a bit with Patrick as well, didn't you, through the Royal Society? And
I did. He was made an honorary member of the Royal Society, and I remember appearing at his house on, I think, the 600th anniversary of the Sky at Night programme. He was not very mobile then, but it was wonderful to go to his house and see all his artifacts, etc. So he was a wonderful person. Because the other good thing about him was that he had time for amateur groups. He spent a great deal of his time, as you will know, going around to talk to small groups, etc. And he answered letters, etc. So he was extremely committed, and he was the face of astronomy for most of the British public for several decades.
amazingly prolific as well. I remember commissioning him to write a piece for me when I was a science editor of the Daily Telegraph. And you could almost hear him bashing out the piece on this manual typewriter in about 5 minutes. I mean, he really could write quickly and accurately and well.
Yes, and of course his skill really was to be able to absorb information quickly, you know. There aren't many people who, if something new is explained to them, can stand up in front of a camera and talk without hesitation, deviation or repetition for 2 minutes in a clear way. And that's what he could do, and that's a very rare skill.
Had a wonderful facility. You say, "You've got 60 seconds, Patrick, to do this." He would bring it in to the nail, you know.
Yeah.
And that's the end of the story. And it would be 60 seconds, and he would be off. He was the ultimate professional communicator.
So what about today? What first of all, your feelings about Apollo 50 years on? Has it grown in importance for you, or diminished? Or Martin, how do you feel about it?
Well, I think it seems far more remarkable in retrospect than it did at the time. But I think it does raise the question of what is the future of manned spaceflight, because, of course, although Apollo was the high point of manned spaceflight up till now, space exploration has developed hugely over those 50 years, and we've had the use of space for all kinds of practical purposes. We use it every day. The sat-nav communication, weather forecasting and all that. So space has become an essential part of our lives in a practical way. So we should cheer that on. But of course, in terms of the inspiration, etc., there's been nothing quite like Apollo. And the question is, will it revive? And I discussed this a bit in my book. I think my view is that unless the Chinese want to do a space spectacular, it'll be very hard to justify doing a massive space project and do it with enough safety constraints to make the American public or the European public happy with it.
And just to be specific, we're talking about human
with
space
humans,
flight.
yes. And of course the other point is that the practical case for sending people is now much weaker because robots can do so much more. I mean, up till now, you've had to have people to actually look at the geology of Mars and things like that. But in future, robots will be able to do this more cheaply. They'll be able to fabricate structures in space or on the moon, and you won't need to send people. But I think we still hope that people will go into space, and I think they will, but they will go as adventurers prepared to take high risks, people with the same mindset as those who do dangerous sports, those who hang glide in Yosemite, who go around the world in balloons and things like that, or the ancient explorers of the 16th and 17th centuries. People like that. And they're prepared to take higher risks than taxpayers can impose on people they're paying for. And that's why I think the future of manned spaceflight lies with these private companies. The most prominent are SpaceX and Blue Origin, which are run by Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, two of the richest people in America, who are excited by these technocratic possibilities.
Would you go as far as to say that actually we've squandered money on human space flight in the last decade? I mean, say the International Space Station. I seem to remember you've said some unkind things about that in the past.
Well, I think I have. And if you look back at the International Space Station and the shuttle,
white elephant come into my mind, actually.
Yes, I think, well, yes. Well, certainly not worth the 12-figure sum, which it cost over 30 years. Of course, many astronomers, like Tommy Gold, were against it right from the start. And I think it is clear that the scientific output was minimal, and I think one could have done far more for the money. And if we look at the high points of space in the intervening 50 years since Apollo, it's been the Hubble Space Telescope and the explorations and the wonderful pictures beamed back from the outer planets,
So,
things like that.
Don't you think he's ruining the romance of space here?
I kind of go along with what Martin is saying. I mean, I get most excited these days by lots of these NASA missions, none of which are manned, but they can go a lot further than a man could ever go. You can't get to Jupiter as a man. It's not practical. It's not going to happen. It'd take a lifetime. You couldn't possibly get to Pluto, but these probes are so intelligent now. They've gone there and they take all the pictures you want to. You can be a tourist without ever stepping out of your room with your TV, and I find that very exciting. The Rosetta mission, which went to a comet, the New Horizons, which went to Pluto, and there are new OSIRIS-REx, which has gone to an asteroid. I'm very much involved in looking at the pictures that are coming back. They're wonderful. You don't have to be there, and actually it'd be very uncomfortable to be there because there's nothing to do. And all you've got to do is think about getting back, which is going to be hard. So I'm with you, Martin, really. I think the most exciting stuff is happening before our very eyes.
Yes, but on the other hand, that's the reason why I don't think NASA or ESA should do this. But on the other hand, if these private companies choose to do it, and people are prepared to go, accepting high risks, then I think we should cheer them on.
Absolutely.
And I think there will be such people.
Absolutely.
And they will go back to the moon. Already people have bought tickets to go around the backside of the moon and come back.
I would love it. I've got to admit.
Yes, there's I think a Japanese has bought a ticket for him and 7 friends to go around the backside of the moon, going further from Earth than any human's been before, a 5-day trip. There's also talk about a trip to Mars, where you don't land, but just go round it. This would take 500 days, and would indeed be very boring, and it'd be cooped up, and so the...
You'd be fried by radiation.
Well, the ideal crew, they said, would be a stable middle-aged couple, happy to be cooped up together, old enough they don't care too much about radiation damage.
Right.
So this is an idea. But more seriously, I think there will be people who will want to go, and Elon Musk himself has said that he would hope to die on Mars, but not on impact. This is not a crazy aspiration 30 or 40 years from now. So if you ask me to bet, I think that by the end of the century, there will be a group of pioneers living probably on Mars. They'll be privately funded, privately sponsored, and they'll be the kind of people like Sir Ranulph Fiennes, for instance, or people who take very high risks in climbing. I think we should cheer them on for all kinds of reasons.
If you talk about the revival, some people do talk about the revival of the Apollo spirit. Do you think that the moon is a bit of a diversion and Mars is the big prize now? Or do you think there is a value to putting a staging post on the moon? I know there's been talk about telescopes on the other side of the moon and all that stuff, but a colony on the moon.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think the idea of some sort of base person doing science on the moon is worthwhile. Mining the moon, I'm not sure about. I mean, so some things perhaps are worth mining from the moon or from asteroids if you want to build something in space from them. But the idea of mining stuff on the moon and bringing it to the Earth, I don't think that's ever going to make economic sense. And so I think Mars is obviously the big challenge, and there will be people who will want to go even on one-way trips to Mars. And I think we should cheer them on, just like we cheer on people who do other sort of extreme things at the limits of what humans could possibly do.
Have you been tempted, Brian?
Well, I think any astronomer would love to sit on the moon and observe the universe, because there's no pollution, there's no air in the way. What a wonderful thing. And I would be able to see the zodiacal light, which is my subject, my PhD. So I would love to do it. I'm probably too old now. But yeah, I think the idea of having a colony on the moon to do that kind of stuff is very attractive. And it's not that far away, relatively, to the stuff we've been talking about.
But when you're very old, you might go with a one-way ticket.
You might, really.
I might. I'm not quite old enough, but maybe I would one day. Yeah.
We were going to do a concert on this big arena on the moon, but they said there's no atmosphere. So I've completely brought the whole thing down.
So in terms of focusing, swiftly moving on. Sorry. Martin, in terms of candidates for where would you put a moon base if you were to go ahead with that? Because there are some favoured spots on the moon.
That's right. If there's a moon base, there's craters near the lunar poles. There's one called the Shackler crater, which has walls about 4 kilometres high. And this has the virtue that in the bottom, it's very cold indeed. No sunlight gets in. So you might have ice there in water. But on the other hand, on the sides of the crater, on the rim, then there's always some light. And so the ideal would be to have the base on the top of the rim of one of these craters at the lunar poles. I think that would be the best bet. Because then the temperature doesn't have the big range which it does everywhere else on the moon, where you have 2 weeks of darkness, then 2 weeks of light.
Would you go, Martin? Would you go?
I wouldn't go really, I don't think, but it would be tempting, wouldn't it?
Very, very.
So we're going to open up to the audience for questions in a few minutes, but one theme I just wanted to explore with both of you is there's sort of a discussion about, we need a plan B because we're degrading the environment of planet Earth. And obviously that's central to the themes that in your past 2 books, Martin. But do you think that's a dangerous way of thinking? I know that, Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk have talked about having a plan B, but how do you feel about that?
I think that's a dangerous delusion. As I said, I think that there will be a few crazy pioneers living on Mars by the end of the century, and I think we should cheer them on for reasons which I could mention a bit later, perhaps. But the idea of mass emigration to Mars is, I think, a dangerous delusion, because it's far easier to deal with climate change on the Earth than to terraform Mars. And living on Mars is far less comfortable than living at the South Pole or top of Everest, etc. So I don't really see much virtue in this, nor actually in the different idea which Jeff Bezos has of having huge freely floating colonies. He's reviving an idea that a guy called O'Neill had in the 1970s of having huge cylinders several miles long, which spin very slowly. And according to O'Neill, you would have what looks like a Californian suburb on the inside of them, you know, with artificial gravity from the centrifugal effects. And Bezos has the idea that lots of people want to live up there, and perhaps not so crazy that industry could be put out into space. That's not crazy, but if that is done, it could probably best be done by robots and not by people. So I genuinely think that mass migration of people to Mars or into space is unlikely, and it'll be something for adventurers. But just to go on to why I think this, as an astronomer, I am aware that not only are we the result of 4 billion years of evolution to get from primordial slime to us, but we're not the combination. The time ahead is at least as long. The Earth will go on for about 5 billion years before the sun flares up and dies, and the universe will go on perhaps forever. And to quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. So we are at an important transition stage in cosmic evolution, a stage where perhaps there's no more Darwinian selection, but we will have a sort of secular intelligent design when we can modify human beings by genetic adaptation and maybe even download ourselves into some electronic form. Now, this is going to be possible, perhaps by the end of a century, but obviously we're going to regulate this for all kinds of reasons, prudential and ethical on the Earth. But imagine these people in space, on Mars. They're away from all the regulators, they're ill-adapted to where they are on Mars. So they will use all these techniques of genetic modification and cyborg techniques to adapt to this hostile environment. They'd have the motive and the opportunity. And so within a few centuries, they would have evolved into a completely different species. And if they become electronic rather than flesh and blood, then of course they may not need an atmosphere anymore, they may prefer zero G, and they may be near immortal. So then they would go off into the blue yonder, maybe far beyond the solar system. So you could think on a very long astronomical time scale that this century is crucial. It will be the century where we jumpstart a completely new kind of evolution, which happened on a technological time scale, not on a biological time scale, and that could lead to exploration far beyond even our solar system. But this is a post-human, not a human enterprise.
Just winding back to the human enterprise,
Yeah.
Brian, what do you feel the? I mean, it's an extraordinary kind of epic vision there. But that basic question, Brian, about off-world colonies actually distracting us from very earthly problems and so on. Do you have a strong feeling about that?
I have strong feelings about the way we treat our planet and the way that we treat each other and the way that we treat the other creatures on this planet. Yeah, I think we have it completely wrong. I think we exploit everything, imagining that the human race is the only important thing. And there's no evidence that I see to support that view. I think an alien coming along wouldn't naturally assume that the human being was the best part of creation. So yes, I have a serious issue with it. And if we take that kind of behavior into space, if there were other creatures out there, we wouldn't be very well equipped to deal with that. So yeah, I have an issue. I would like to see us restart the way we treat each other and the planet. Maybe before we start trying to push ourselves. But I'm fascinated by your vision of the far future, because these AI creatures are our descendants, right? They are part of our evolution. That's the way you see it.
Yeah, it could be. But of course, whether this is important cosmically depends on the question that we're most often asked as astronomers: are we alone? Is there life out there
Well, I'm
already?
going to ask you,
Yeah.
if we encounter an alien,
Yeah.
you seem to be suggesting it's bound to be machine intelligence rather than flesh and blood intelligence.
Yes, well, of course, the first thing is we don't know if there are intelligent aliens. It's worth a look and of course there are projects to look. But if life, intelligent life, is unique to the Earth within the galaxy, then I think the important point I want to make is that doesn't mean that life will forever be a trivial feature of the cosmos, because in the billions of years that lie ahead, life seeded from Earth could spread through the galaxy. So we're not even at the halfway stage of the emergence of complexity. But on the other hand, as you say, it's quite possible that life exists in many, many places in the galaxy, and maybe has developed beyond our stage. And I indeed think that we should look for any evidence for artificial entities or artificial transmissions. And I also think that if we detect something, it will be something which is created by an electronic intelligence, not a flesh and blood one. And that's simply an analogy with the Earth, because, as I said, it's taken 4 billion years for us to evolve, and we've had humans for less than 1 million years. We've had technology for 10,000 years at most, and maybe within a few centuries, that'll be taken over by non-human entities, more intelligence, and they will have a billion years ahead of us. So it's unlikely that if we found an Earth-like planet on which there'd been evolution, that we'd catch it in this sliver of time when it's got intelligent flesh and blood creatures on it. Either it would be far behind us, in which case there'd be no evidence of intelligence, or it would be far ahead, in which case we would detect not something on the planet itself, but maybe some entities somewhere in interstellar space.
I mean, we're scanning lots of frequencies, aren't we?
Yes.
We're looking for signs of water, but it sounds to me like you think that this might be a rather parochial view of the possibilities.
Well, I mean, I
of
think
life.
we've no idea what to look for, so I think it's important that astronomers should always be on the lookout for something surprising, and also to look for artifacts. I mean, just some huge structure in space, or even some asteroid that looks especially round and shiny, as it were, which could be, as Arthur C. Clarke reminded us, it could be something left by an external civilization. The chance of this is small, but it's so exciting. It's worth an effort, and it's very good that there are some private people, in particular Yuri Milner in California, who's funding a program to do more systematic searches for evidence of something artificial. So I think it's worthwhile doing this.
Have you been involved in search for extraterrestrial intelligence or SETI,
really.
Brian?
No, I know some people from SETI, and it's not really my area. Instinctively, I could be wrong, but I'm unusual in this. I don't know what your feeling is, Marty, but I kind of think that it's possible that, in spite of the billions and billions of Earth-like planets which we know are out there, it is possible that this is the only time this happened. There's such a gap in our knowledge. We don't know how these primitive organic molecules got to the point where they could reproduce for a start, and where they could evolve, because you can't evolve without reproduction. And I don't think anybody knows yet. I don't think we can even hazard a guess. So, supposing we were the only time in the universe where this happened, it gives a very different view of.
Yes, I think that's possible. I think those questions may be answered in the next 20 or 30 years in two ways. First, as you say, the origin of life, the transition from chemistry to the first replicating, metabolizing entities we call alive, that's not understood. No. And it's one of these problems which scientists have realized is important, but they put in a too difficult box, as it were. Whereas now, there are very serious people working on it. And I think we will know within 20 years how life began here on Earth, and whether it was a rare accident, whether it would have happened elsewhere, and whether the basis of DNA and RNA is unique or whether it could be different. So we might understand that. But the other thing, of course, is that the biggest excitement in astronomy in the last 10, 20 years, in my view, has been discovering that most other stars in the sky are orbited by retinues of planets, just as the Earth and the Sun orbit the Earth, and the other planets orbit our Sun. And we've already identified evidence for thousands of these planets, and it seems that one star in 5 or thereabouts will have a planet rather like the Earth orbiting it. Like the Earth in a sense, it's about the size of the Earth and the distance from its parent star such that water can exist. And at the moment, those planets, even around the nearest stars, are too faint to be directly detected. We know they're there by two techniques, either observing a star and that it gets slightly dimmer if a planet transits in front of it, or by detecting a small wobble in the motion of a star due to the gravitational pull of a planet. We don't directly observe these planets, but the next generation of telescopes will, in particular, the European Southern Observatory, which is a consortium that we belong to and will belong to despite Brexit, which is good news. This is going to be the world's best telescope, and it's going to be in Chile. It'll have a mirror 39 meters across. That's, I think, probably bigger than the width of this lecture hall. Not one sheet of glass, but a mosaic of 800 pieces of glass. And this will collect enough light to be able to analyze the light from a planet like the Earth orbiting a star like the Sun. And of course, this will give us some clues, as the great James Lovelock first realized, to whether the atmosphere has been affected by something alive. So within 20 years, we may know two things. We may know how life began on the Earth and how rare it is. We may know whether there's anything alive on nearby planets orbiting other stars. But of course, even then, it could be that the step from simple life to intelligent life involved so many contingencies that could still be rare.
I didn't realise until recently, because in the last century it was a popular view that if you got some carbon and some oxygen and hydrogen and put a spark through them, there's a good chance that you would be able to make life, right?
Yeah.
There's been lots of films about
That's Frankenstein.
Yeah, which led to very showy. But in fact, the research, the genome research now indicates that all life on this planet, I don't know if you know this, I was shocked, comes from one event. So not just all humans, all mammals, all insects, all plant life, all protozoa, all bacterial life, from one event. It seems that the whole tree comes from, which to me is shocking. You know, did it happen more than once? Did it nearly happen another
It could
time?
nearly happen and just one survived. That's possible.
Yeah, did it happen twice and one side obliterated the other? We don't know, but there's only evidence of this happening once on this incredibly rich planet of ours, right?
Martin, what do you think about this, following on from that, the speculation that if you look at what are called extremophiles on Earth, which are bugs that can put up with the most extraordinarily tough environments, you know, they dine on wet rock 3 miles underground, they're floating over our heads, they're in highly salty environments, and given that there was, through impacts of big objects, exchange of material between Mars and Earth, and there was water on Mars,
Yes.
isn't it kind of inevitable that there's going to be at least some simple life on Mars, or do you think I'm getting ahead of myself?
So I think that is possible, and in a sense we could all be Martians, because the life could have started on Mars and come
That's
to the
right.
Earth. And incidentally, that therefore means that if we detected something living on Mars, some frozen bacteria or something, it wouldn't indicate an independent origin. And that's why, incidentally, what would be really exciting would be to find life in the outer solar system, under the ice of Europa, which is a planet, a moon of Jupiter, or Enceladus, a moon of Saturn. Because if you found life, something swimming under that ice, that almost certainly couldn't have come from the Earth, or vice versa, and that would immediately tell us that the galaxy was full of life. Because if it had evolved twice independently in one planetary system, then that suggests it's not rare. And so it's very important, I think, to do what we can to try and explore these outer planets by sending robotic submarines to go under the ice of those two moons, etc. That would be very exciting. But we just don't know at the moment.
Now, I think we should take a couple of questions from the audience. Have we've got one there. If you can wait until you get the microphone.